I'm going to now pass over to Cameron Tonkinwire. So Cameron reached out to me to mention that Terry was here, so thank you to Cameron for that. And he's going to introduce Terry.
Thanks, Kat. I had the privilege of actually talking here earlier in the year a little bit about transition design, and it was very exciting to know that Terry Irwin's coming down for the International Social Innovation Research Conference in Melbourne next week. So she was very kind enough to kind of stop off in Sydney on the way down. If you're going to come this far, you should make it worthwhile. I worked with Terry for 5 years at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh before returning home to Sydney at the beginning of this year. I was very lucky to kind of, in fact, be approached by Terry when I was at Parsons and given the opportunity to work with her and her colleagues at Carnegie Mellon to really set up one of, I think, still one of the most interesting design curriculum around. It was an incredible opportunity to be given. Terry is someone I have enormous respect for many reasons, but one in particular that I think is appropriate just to say by way of introduction in relation to transition is because Terry herself models really quite radical transitions of herself. And so I won't go into kind of what Terry was until the moment at which she kind of decided to self-fund herself to go to Europe and study design, to go to Basel and really study with some of the great Swiss colour theorists and typographers, or from around the world who just happened to be gathered in that area. But this was the kind of first moment, or maybe second or third moment, of reinvention and just an incredibly resourced transformation of who this person was. Then Terry came and worked with leading branding firms on the West Coast and then set up her own design firm, an experienced design firm, Meta, and really was one of the most important experienced design firms on the West Coast right up until the first dot-com boom, doing incredible work and ran a very large firm under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And so that was kind of the second, at least, transition as far as I know that Terry's undertaken. And then partly as a result of realising just how unsustainable that industry was. I don't think Terry's going to tell that story this evening, but just how incredibly unsustainable that kind of work was, doubled up by the fact that Bush got into power. A kind of third transition was Terry deciding to just leave all that behind and move to the UK and study integral science at Schumacher College, doing a master's program there. And so this was this third complete reinvention. A fourth reinvention was finally when asked back now to become a kind of academic, to lead one of the most important design schools in the United States, the School of Design at Carnegie Mellon, where she is still the head of design there, the head of the School of Design. And effect really, as I said at the beginning, one of the most important transformations in relation to curriculum. So I think I spend a lot of time yelling at people about change and the importance of change. But I would have to say that I've done very little personal change. I could do with a lot of personal change. And to that extent, I have still so much to learn from Terry Irwin. I had such a privilege working with her for 5 years. And so I'm very honoured to be able to introduce her to you tonight to talk to you about transition design. Terry.
Thank you, Cameron. Thanks for having me here. Well, that was a lovely introduction and very embarrassing. It's great to be here. I mean, we've been so welcomed, and it's important for me to say that, I'm here to talk about transition design, which has gotten a lot of interest, mainly because I think transition is a meme that's really interesting a lot of people. But it began as a conversation between a designer, practitioner, a philosopher, Cameron, and a social ecologist, Gideon, my partner. So the three of us are here tonight, and I feel like every time I get up and talk about it, I owe a debt to these two as well. It's all three of us. So I'm going to share with you our latest thinking on transition design. It's obviously it's a work in progress. It acknowledges lots of other work that's going on. in foresighting, certainly cases work. There's many people around on the planet right now thinking about this imperative to transition to more sustainable futures. So this is what we've introduced at Carnegie Mellon, where we've made it open source since day one, and there's a lot of people that are very happily joining the conversation with us. Can you guys see the slides okay? No. I'm wondering, oh, it's because of me. You're lighting me. That's okay. So I am a terrible speaker in that I digress wildly and I go horribly over time. So I'm going to sort of keep to my notes in order to keep to time tonight, and I hope you'll bear with that. Is that a bit better? Yeah. Okay, great. So in this talk, I want to talk about transition design, which is really about systems level change and transitions to more sustainable futures. And we like to say that it actually brings together two global memes. The first is the idea that entire societies are going to need to transition toward more sustainable futures. And the second is the realization that these transitions will require intentional systems level change. And you can see evidence of these memes in the number of transition-related projects and initiatives that are springing up around the world, and the rise in what I'll call deep systems thinking, and the proliferation of knowledge and tools and processes that are cropping up to understand and map complex systems and systems problems. Now, it's important to understand that our societies are in a constant state of transition. But these transitions are largely unintentional and they're full of drift. And we only really understand the ramifications of these transitions in hindsight. We call it history. And the question before us, we think in the 21st century, is really, can we intentionally direct these transitions toward more sustainable futures? So transition design is really concerned with two types of systems: socio-technical systems and wicked problems, which are really systems problems. And socio-technical systems are really tangles of societal infrastructure, and that they are permeated by people and all manner of designed artifacts, processes, and scripted interactions. And all of these, of course, are embedded within the natural environment. Now, the list of wicked problems is long and will get longer. Both socio-technical systems and wicked problems share characteristics. They exist at multiple levels of scale, and they are interconnected and interdependent. Therefore, changes in one area of the system ramify throughout in unpredictable ways. These systems are everywhere, and their ubiquity is perhaps best explained by this old joke. Two fish bump into each other, and one says to the other, "How's the water?" And the other says, "What water?" Marshall McLuhan, in his book War and Peace in the Global Village, said, "One thing fish know nothing about is water, since they have no anti-environment which would enable them to perceive the element that they live in." So systems are like this. They are so ubiquitous, and our interactions with them are so pervasive that we really don't see them, and therefore we don't understand them very well. But these unnoticed systems produce their own patterns of behavior over time, and they become entrenched and intractable. And therefore, directing societal transitions toward unsustainable futures. So transition design aspires to develop an approach to shift the trajectory of these systems through strategically placed, designed interventions. So in that way, transition design, we think, resembles Chinese acupuncture in its approach. How many people have had acupuncture in here? God, Australia is so much better than this. So acupuncturists, as you know, look for points of intervention that have the greatest potential to transition the system back into balance and health. But where those needles are placed can seem wildly counterintuitive, but is actually based upon a deep understanding of the body's systems dynamics. So transition design proposes a similar approach to seed and catalyze the transition of these socio-technical systems towards sustainability. And some of you probably know there's a group of scientists, engineers, and researchers in Northern Europe that have actually been mapping the anatomy and dynamics of historical transitions within socio-technical systems for nearly 2 decades. So they are essentially providing a roadmap or a meridian map for initiating these transitions. I can barely believe anybody's been doing this, but they have. So the Sustainability Transitions Network has identified 3 key systems levels: the landscape, the regime, and the niche. And they argue that systems transitions are always the result of both large and small events, technological innovations and breakthroughs, and this is really important, changes in beliefs, social norms, and practices in everyday life. So this diagram shows how the events, innovations, and changes at the different systems levels spark the transition from the horse-drawn carriage to the automobile. Now, I've highlighted just one of the shifts or destabilizations that contributed to this transition. So, the invention of electricity at the landscape level opened up the possibility at the niche level for an unchallenged experiment like the electric tram. The tram's success, in turn, changed the entire infrastructure at the regime level through paved roads and surfaces. Now, this regime change led to the phenomenon of suburbanization at the landscape level, which in turn changed the way entire generations of people have lived their lives. So these researchers hypothesize that if we can better understand how these transitions happened in the past, we should be able to intentionally seed transitions toward more positive futures. Transition design aspires to develop tools for doing just that. So strategically placed small and large designed interventions have the potential to shift entire socio-technical systems over various horizons of time. So for example, take a community's need to transition toward water security. Transition designers might read the socio-technical landscape to understand what led to the water shortage in the first place. Then intentionally seed and catalyze a system transition toward a more positive future. But a transition toward what? So this is the point at which it becomes clear that a new approach is needed that integrates a rigorous and creative process for thinking about long-term futures and these large societal interventions and transitions. So even a cursory search on Google or Pinterest reveals a staggering array of futuring and foresighting tools and methodologies that have sprung up in recent years. And now there is a clear intersection between foresight studies and design. Just this year, the Australian futurist Stuart Candy joined our faculty, and we're actually working to integrate foresighting into design process and research at the undergraduate, master's, and doctoral levels of our program. The transition design approach sits at the intersection of foresighting and systems design with an emphasis on resolving and leveraging stakeholder relations. So visioning and backcasting is one of the most important aspects of transition design and is based upon the simple premise that if we don't have a clear vision of where we want to go, we won't stand a chance of getting there. The co-creation of visions of desirable futures enables stakeholders with conflicting agendas to transcend their differences in the present and enter into a space where they can focus on their common values, hopes, and desires. So political activist and author Stephen Duncombe has said, visions can inspire us to imagine that things could be radically different than they are today, and then believe that we could actually progress toward that imaginary world. These long-term visions can also act as both a magnet drawing us toward the desired future and a compass that guides the creation of projects and initiatives in the present. Fred Pollack, one of the founding fathers of future studies, said, "When the dominant images of a culture are anticipatory, they lead social development and provide a direction for social change." And Stuart Brand, in his book, The Clock of the Long Now, asks, how do we make long-term thinking automatic and common instead of difficult and rare? Transition design proposes that one of the roots of wicked problems is actually our inability to think in long horizons of time. So we fail to consider the consequences of our actions and the things we design. Western societies think in terms of fiscal quarters, fashion seasons, and perhaps annual projections. But rarely do we think farther out than that. Resolving wicked problems will require design for the long-term future, for dozens of years, decades, or even centuries. Wicked problems took a long time to get wicked and will therefore take a long time to get resolved. So the cone of the future is a foresighting approach that refutes the idea that the future is inevitable, fixed, and static. Rather, it is a broad realm of possibilities that can be explored in rigorous ways, and preferable futures can be defined and articulated at high levels of fidelity. So the emerging transition design approach, and we call it approach intentionally, not a process, calls for deep stakeholder involvement and proposes 3 context-setting steps. Step 1 helps stakeholders achieve a shared understanding of the problem, resolve their conflictual relations, and leverage their points of alignment. Step 2 enables stakeholders to co-create compelling visions of a long-term desirable future toward which they wish to transition. It also establishes radically large socio-temporal contexts for both the problem and the vision. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Step 3 involves backcasting from the desired future to create a transition pathway to the present, along which the ecologies of interventions can be situated. And it looks something like this. Ecologies of interventions at multiple levels of scale, implemented over multiple horizons of time, that are connected to each other via the long-term future vision. These ecologies act as steps along the transition pathway and are comprised of both new and existing projects of all kinds. This is where social innovation and many of the traditional design approaches most of us in this room have mastered come into play at the level of designing discrete interventions. The problem that transition design attempts to address is the one-off nature of many interventions due to the tight problem frames that are often imposed. So in traditional design approaches, and this is certainly the way I was educated and trained, designers find or are given a problem that is clearly defined within a relatively small context. In other words, a manageable problem that we've probably solved before. This is what Horst would call a tame problem. If we frame all problems within these tidy frames, we can solve them every time with the approaches that we already have. We do this in the posture of an expert who says, I've seen this before, I know what to do, get out of my way and let me do it. If, however, we include social and environmental concerns in the problem frame and we consider all of the stakeholders affected by the problem, things quickly start to get very, very gnarly, and we realize that the problem that we think we see is actually a symptom of something much bigger. And it starts to feel something like this. The more you trace the roots of a wicked problem up systems levels, the more intimidating it gets. So when and if you're finally able to see the entire problem, it's overwhelming. If you persist and consider the context of the problem, which is the larger socio-technical ecological systems within which it's embedded, then things get really hairy. And that's about the time that you hear people say, as Horst Rittel did, that problem is simply unsolvable. Or, I can't put a dent in that, anything I would do would be like a drop in the ocean. This is the scale at which it becomes clear that no single individual, no single discipline or profession can solve a wicked problem or transition a societal system. The sheer magnitude of the problem and its context demands transdisciplinarity, radical collaboration, tenacity, and patience. And we think a new problem-solving approach for seeding systems-level change. So transition design works with stakeholders to develop a long-term vision of a future in which the problem has been resolved, then undertakes a process of auditing existing one-off solutions within both the problem frame and its context to determine which ones have the potential to be connected to each other via that long-term vision. Some projects will be in natural alignment, while others may need slight adjustments to integrate into an ecology of interventions that transition design advocates. This approach also reveals potential points of intervention where new projects can be situated that will actually catalyze exponential change. It's like the needle that they put in your ear when you have a headache. So this is where the acupuncture metaphor comes in. The challenge is how to methodically and productively explore large socio-technical contexts and the wicked problems contained within them. So in order to do this, we've been working with this thing we're calling the spatiotemporal matrix, within which the problem and the future vision are situated. It's essentially a sketch for conducting research and a template for articulating future visions. We ask research questions unique to each area of this matrix and think of it as looking up and down in space and backwards and forwards in time. So we situate both the problem and the vision in the mid-systems level in order to look at how both large and small events contribute to the problem and can inform a different future. So we look at the past because the origin of complex problems always lie there. It takes problems a very long time to get wicked. And we look at how people in the past were living and how what societal norms were like before the problem arose. In the present, we look for contributing factors at all levels of scale and their ramifications for both society and everyday life. But in the future, we ask stakeholders to further articulate their visions and ask, what would societal norms and beliefs, how would they have changed if the problem had been resolved? What technologies might or might not exist? And everyday life and lifestyles, how would they perhaps have changed for the better? Exploring this large context informs the design of these ecologies of interventions that will exist at multiple levels of scale and will be implemented over long, mid, and short horizons of time. So as an example, consider the problem of break-ins and muggings in our neighborhood. To address the problem, we might increase the number of police on the beat, we might start a block watch, an email group, and make sure everyone has burglar alarms in their houses and pepper spray in their backpacks. But that's really not going to get at the root of the problem. We can see that these break-ins and muggings are connected to the bigger wicked problem of crime at the city level. And city-level crime is related to other wicked problems such as drug addiction, gang violence, a lack of affordable housing, a rising divorce rate, racial profiling, unemployment, gentrification, and influx of high-tech businesses and employees, to name only a few. But the roots of these problems also have connections at the national level. And they involve really big problems, such as bank bailouts, federal penal codes, Supreme Court rulings, the housing market collapse, the opioid epidemic, the high cost of education, a lack of prison vocational training programs, and widespread unemployment. So depending upon how you look at it, this can be overwhelming, or it can become an opportunity to look for leverage points in the bigger system and develop interventions that are designed to kill as many birds with one stone as possible. That is really the concept behind the transition design process. Can we kill as many birds with one stone as possible? Questioner facilitates dialogues around big questions with large consequences, such as what is the good life? What is the moral limit of markets? If something is possible, does it mean that it's also viable? The questioner makes sure that citizens from diverse social groups take part in the debates. The gardener seeds transition by identifying, connecting, supporting, and spotlighting pioneers of the new system, by watering the seeds of new ideas and enabling change through emergence. Emergence happens when separate local efforts are connected to form communities of practice, and once this happens, systems level change can actually be catalyzed. The connector creates connections and learning cycles between systems levels and geographic locations. Complex social systems are comprised of members of civil society and industry that form clusters of networks, movements, grassroots organizations, each with their own language, norms, and belief systems. Connecting these clusters to enable learning and information exchange is a key leverage point for change in systems. And socio-technical systems are permeated, as we all know, by designed artifacts, built structures, communications, scripted interactions, and behaviors. So the maker plays a really important part by bringing a deep understanding of the materiality and human needs in the creation of these design touchpoints within a complex system. The maker ensures that all of these things are desirable, viable, feasible, and sustainable. These roles, in a way, illustrate the transdisciplinary nature in designing for transition and the need for people from very diverse disciplines to design them. But really, the point of lectures like this is to try and constitute an international conversation about the need for systems level change and propose it as a new complementary area of design focus. We hope that one day something like transition studies will be an integrated topic on most university campuses and will bring together many transition initiatives such as the Great Transition Initiative, the Commons Transition, Transition Towns, Transition Design, and many others. So right now, a global network is emerging of educators, researchers, and practitioners from different disciplines. We now have about 6 partner universities that are integrating transition design into curricula and research strands, And we're working with about 4 professional design organizations who are willing to roll up their sleeves and sort of test the emerging approach. We think there's a really important role or partnership to be forged between academic researchers and design practitioners. So far, we've held 3 annual transition design symposia in the US and the UK, and last summer in Barcelona. And each summer we teach short courses which have been attended by people from all walks of life in more than 20 countries. And next June we'll teach a 10-day course at Schumacher College, followed by a 2-day symposium that we hope will bring together representatives from all of those main transition-related strands that I talked to. So our hope is that within 3 to 5 years, transition design, no matter what it's called, can offer tools and methods to these transdisciplinary teams that are working on large transition-related projects and initiatives, and that will have graduated a new generation of designer that's capable of joining those teams. So the latest information on is really on our transition design seminar website. Gideon and I, and Cameron, when he was still with us, would teach a semester-long seminar to the master's and doctoral students in transition design. And we put the whole syllabus up as an open source website so that other educators can teach from it or borrow from it. And probably the most accessible way in is to look at additional resources. We've got a lot of videos and overview kinds of things on there. There's a lot of information up on my academia.edu page. And I think finally, the important thing to say is we're trying to constitute a conversation, first among design educators and design practitioners, but 3, 4, even 10 people aren't going to figure this out. So mostly we're just wanting to exchange ideas and get other people involved in the conversation, no matter what you call it. So thank you.